Hi, welcome everybody. And thanks especially to the Colin Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership at CCNY for hosting this event, which is co-sponsored with Columbia University's Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality and the South Asia Institute. And we're thrilled that you're joining us for this discussion and launch of Dr. Nimi Gaurunathan's new book, Radicalizing Her, Why Women Choose Violence. I'm Lila Abulurud, and I teach gender and anthropology at Columbia, and I'm really honored to be moderating this discussion, especially because I've been involved for the last 3 or 4 years in a collaborative project on the geopolitics of gender violence out of our Center for the Study of Social Difference, funded by the Luce Foundation and its initiative on religion and international affairs. And Professor Gaurunathan has made me think in new ways about gender and violence. And I came to know her through that broad interest in the global feminist anti-GBV agenda, but especially my own worries about how it had got tied up with what is known in the security world as violent extremism and radicalization. And in turn, this sort of unanthropological interest grew out of my earlier work on the ways feminism had been instrumentalized to justify military invasion of Afghanistan in the name of saving the oppressed Muslim woman. But I've also had a long interest in liberation movements and was so glad to discover her work around women militants and freedom fighters. And we persuaded her to offer a course this spring at our institute for research on women, gender, and sexuality at Columbia, a course that I'd actually introduced when I came in 2001, Gender and Power in Global Perspective. And one of our first classes was on 9/11, actually. When we heard that she had a new book coming out, we wanted a chance to hear her talk about it. And the South Asia Institute was equally excited because so much of what she's done is around the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. However, as institutes at Columbia, we were standing last week in solidarity with Graduate Workers Union, and our graduate students had been on strike since March 15th, seeking a fair contract. We didn't want to cross the picket line, but we also didn't want to deprive those who were interested in hearing about this book the chance to do so. So we were really glad to be able to move it to CCNY, where Dr. Gaurunathan is a visiting research professor. So here we are, and I'm happy to say that the graduate student workers have actually paused their strike, hoping for progress in the negotiations through mediation. So I have just a few words of introduction to our speakers before we get going. Many of us at Columbia, at the Colin Powell School, and around the country and the world who are joining us today feel fortunate to be in conversation with Nimi. She's taught at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs in the past, and that's where I first met her. We were invited by the very enthusiastic students specializing in gender policy to speak on a packed panel on feminism and security. And it was through Professor Dipali Mukherjee, who we're so happy to have joining us today, that I had a chance to be part of an eye-opening conference in 2019 that the two of them organized on women waging war, on the distinctive politics of women who participate in violence. Uh, Dr. Gaurunathan defines herself as a writer, a scholar, and an activist whose research interests include gender and violence, female extremism, social movements, issues of asylum, ethnic conflict, and the impact of militarization, displacement, and race in Sri Lanka. And in her latest article that just came out in the Los Angeles Review of Books, she takes on what she calls white feminism. I'll be asking her a little more about this later. But she's quite unusual, maybe unique, in being able to move between policy forms and intimate work with women activists who fought in a variety of deadly conflict situations. And her work on the female fighter has been featured in Vice, Harper's, Foreign Policy, Freeman's Journal, Guernica, and the New York Times. And she's also the publisher of Adi magazine, a literary magazine aiming to rehumanize policy, something that I think she does herself. And it's really such a pleasure to be part of this launch of her new book, Radicalizing Her, to be published by Beacon Press. I think April 19th is the publication date. Nimi, I
The
think we
13th,
can see
next
your
week.
name, but hello,
Next week, April 13th. Yeah,
next
thank you
week.
so much.
Perfect. It's also my pleasure to introduce and welcome Professor Dipali Mukhopadhyay, who is Associate Professor of Global Policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And her extraordinary research, based on extensive fieldwork in some very, very tough places, and tough places not just for women, but for everyone, focuses on the relationship between political violence, state building, and governance during and after war. And she's currently serving as senior expert on the Afghanistan peace process for the US Institute for Peace. And she's author with Kimberly Howe of a forthcoming book that we're all waiting for very much, called Good Rebel Governance: Revolutionary Politics and Western Intervention in Syria. And she published in 2014 a highly, highly regarded monograph, Warlords, Strongman Governors, and State Building in Afghanistan. And her move to the University of Minnesota is a great loss for us at Columbia, where for years I felt so lucky to have her as a rare colleague across the street, as we say at our School of International and Public Affairs. Yupali.
Thank you, Lila. I'm so happy to be here.
Great. So our plan this afternoon is to have Professor Garanathan talk for 15, 20 minutes about her book, introducing it and reading selections. Then Professor Mukhopadhyay will comment and raise some questions. And I already know that I won't be able to resist joining the conversation too with a few of my own questions, unless they take up the whole time. But then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And our time is short, so apologies in advance if we don't get to yours. And please put your questions in the Q&A, a button towards the bottom right of your screen, and we'll do our best to share as many as we can before we have to close at 5:45. And the chat function is not available at this webinar. So again, put your questions in the Q&A. And I think that's what I have to say, except to say, Nimi, welcome, and the floor or platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Lila. It was very important to me that this book reach the right audience, one that couldn't really be described to editors and publishers, but that it was embraced by the innately political women who would absorb it into their own struggles. So I'm so deeply grateful that the book is beginning its journey inside the minds of women I deeply admire, like Lila and Dipali. Over nearly 2 decades of work, I've found that the female fighter is, at best, deeply misunderstood and worst, misjudged. And the closer I came to women branded as extreme, the more normal their decisions seemed, less extreme than mundane. Really, every woman navigating layered circles of captivity. To the outside world, the female fighter, is a threat to be destroyed. For me, it's been important to start with why we don't see her, why we haven't seen her in her complexity. And just a brief excerpt from the book. It is inside the overlapping circles of the moral righteousness of nonviolence and the entrenched beliefs on the inherent nature of women that the female fighter and her motivations are disappeared. If nonviolence is valorized as the only legitimate form of resistance, women are the presumed peaceful, moral core that holds this argument in place. But women in the Tigers and other militant movements did seek a type of power through violence, the power to control the experiences of their everyday existence. So the first barrier to seeing her has always been a selective commitment to nonviolence in resistance. So I've studied, of course, women who have chosen violence as a means of resistance, particularly the Tigers, a separatist movement in Sri Lanka whose history of resistance intertwines with my own family histories. To understand the role of violence in politics, I feel it must first be extracted from the moral imperative to condemn it. So to condone or condemn it from the outside matters very little. Violence is simply a reality in the lives of the women that I have known. In order to end violence, I argue we must first understand the intimate inner workings of violence. If we understand it to be a political act that disproportionately affects women, then we must be able to see that it will have a political impact. In my work here, the choice to participate in violence for women is again seen as extreme. But the violence that led her to the battlefield is the normalized violence of the everyday. The rape that pushes her away from society, the marriage that traps her within it, the military occupation that intrudes on her every movement, and the peaceful savior who seeks to extract her voice from the body it inhabits. As Sandra, a senior member of the FARC in Colombia, once told me, so if a soldier comes at you with a gun, women should respond with what? She asked rhetorically. A Bible, a book, kindness. This title, Radicalizing Her, will at first, and one that I argued for, will be judged by its cover as an active action happening to a powerless her. It is in fact, this book is in fact, a request to recalibrate, to reverse our view of the target, honing in on a violent state and the society it breeds. These structures, the ones that restrain her movement, disappear when the view of the female fighter is myopic, must first be brought into view before they can be seen, studied, dismantled, to provide this urgent corrective on the innate political power in every woman. So the book really focuses on the forces that are out of her control, that radicalize her, rather than the myopic view on the female fighter. And of course, overlapping with entrenched sort of ideas of nonviolence is the captivity, I believe, of our consciousness on gender, a kind of siloed focus on patriarchy and sexual liberation, and the racialized extensions of this that circumscribe the third world woman. From another piece with a colleague of mine, Dr. Angel Johnny, there's a brief quote. Patriarchy is enshrined in the state and the society that wraps around it. In a bid to consolidate power, it assumes a hydra like form. The body, anchored in the patriarchal desire for domination, defends itself with multiple heads: militarization, racism, supremacy. Where misogyny is the hatred of women, racialized supremacy is the hatred of specific women. Radicalizing Her asks, how do we understand the women confronted with the fiery breath of one of the heads that seeks to extinguish an entire race, those that choose to fight the enemy that confronts them, the ones not fighting for women's rights, but the right to exist? And there are two sort of interlinked constructions of women that obstruct our view of the female fighter, right? The first is the construction of the marginalized woman as a victim. And here, along with other colleagues, um, I've written another paper called Emissaries of Empowerment, but essentially defining an individual through their most often sexualized trauma, for me, serves two key purposes. First, interventions into these women's lives can be justified as a moral obligation. Second, a sexualized victim is not seen as a political actor. Radicalizing Her seeks to complicate this along with a related feminist concept framing the victim, the idea of choice or agency that we hear all the time, particularly when it comes to marginalized women. So the narratives in this text reveal that women exist under concentric circles of captivity. Choice in one is not linked to freedom in all, right? And building on Lila's work and others, the impact of this approach overlaps with political ideologies and worldviews that shroud the female fighter in suspicion. Right here, we're happy to support the women who either ally or do not threaten US policy. If she's not someone whose politics we agree with, the female fighter exists at this intersection of entrenched gender perceptions and the rise of xenophobia. As a fighter, she's one of these people, a monster, a sociopath. As a woman, she's broken. Radicalizing Her argues that female fighters do not represent antisocial elements as often described. Rather, they mimic the violence of the state and other forces. Finally, the book considers resistance. It considers the role of political identity and collective mobilization. Of course, there are multiple reasons why women choose violence, but I argue that understanding motivation must be anchored in the role of a political identity, one that's shaped by the violence of the state. This, of course, as I mentioned earlier, requires a kind of recoding what we read as political violence, displacement, sexual violence, cultural repression, a deeper understanding of how each, separately and together, forge these distinctive political identities in women. The book asks, how does the violence that permeates her life radicalize her? So I have a brief selection to do as a reading. It's from the first chapter, which is titled A Battlefield. Um, and the chapter is framed around the idea of advance and retreat. And first, I'll read from an excerpt that explains the concept of advance and retreat. When the women I have known joined the Tigers, they set their lives in multi directional motion. They would begin to move from home to training camp, from training camp to the base, from the base to the battlefield, to another battlefield and another, until they were taken captive, detained, hidden away, and suddenly still. In any insurgency, this movement is a continuum of conscious resistance. Memories of the aggressive mobility of war are marked with peaceful moments of reflection. Retreat can be read as a symbol of defeat, but it is also strategic, a central part of forward movement. The retreat is both tactical, to preserve resources, and thoughtful, an interlude for critical thinking, analysis, and recentering of the political before the next advance. The first section is Advance, Why Women Fight. Like the women in the Tigers, Sandra first revisits her connection to a cause before reflecting on her positioning as a woman. After countless hours with female combatants, I know that budding seeds of consciousness form in women much earlier than we look for them. Sandra recalls, I remember being 10, maybe 11 years old. I would hear the sound of rattling on the street outside and jump under the bed. I was sure it was the soldiers. She later explains that often it was the early morning carts laden with corn bumping along the stone pathways. Though temporarily inaccurate, the fear remains rational. Her adolescence was marked by the moments she takes up public and political space. I was always socially conscious, she says. I was the president of my student council in high school and the head of the community council when I graduated. Nevertheless, she followed the path expected of her, committed to working for change on the inside. We knew the government was rich, they were corrupt, but then there was a huge deficit and everyone got fired. I looked for a job everywhere. Sandra began to sell small items, batteries, clocks, on the streets, wandering farther away from the familiar neighborhoods where she grew up. Eventually, she entered the militarized zones, the camps that she had heard of, the guerrillas she had never met. The FARC, she says, was so close to what I believed inside. I wanted to be a part of this FARC, the one that fought for social justice. Next story. When I meet Akila for the first time, she insists on placing the order herself at the Cozy Cafe on 15th and K in Washington, D.C. An egg and pepper croissant with a Coke. She's free to do so now that she is de radicalized. I admire the yellow swirls around the sequins of her Sovakmis, a faltering attempt at a soft entrance into a hard life. She ignores my remark and begins. I am disgusted now with what politics has become. She sits down in a corner of a cafe, a few blocks from the White House that has just welcomed Donald Trump. Akila explains her choice to me before I can ask. There were aerial bombardments from the government of Sri Lanka every day. I was a child, I was scared, and I knew we had to fight them. A response so simple as to render the question stupid. Her sister had joined the movement a few years earlier as a member of the reconnaissance team. 2 years later, I would share coffee in London with Adele Balasingham, popularly known as simply Auntie, who married into the movement, eventually training and organizing the women in the Tigers. To convince her of my own credibility, when I ask her about the motivations of female cadre, I follow quickly with, of course I understand. It's very complex. She pauses, running her fingers slowly across the marble of the table, as if to smooth the stone. Is it? She asks. And the final section, a retreat, the myth of the female fighter. The common myths shrouding the female fighter are born of deep-seated beliefs about gender more broadly and can be lumped into 4 oppressive myths. Women are more peaceful than men by nature. Women are brainwashed into militant movements. Women join movements because of the men in their lives. Empowerment programming can save the female fighter. Fantastical myths of a liberatory nature are equally problematic. Photographers look to capture her through their own juxtaposition of femininity. Pink manicured nails on an AK-47. Artists in South Asia turn to the goddesses, providing the female fighter with the arms missing in the lives of their worshippers. Cartoons that can never fully sketch the violence of graphic moments outline a woman who is equal parts sensual and fierce. A new incarnation of Wonder Woman is idolized by girls everywhere for the projected power of femininity, ignoring the politics of an actress who supports the violent occupation of Palestinian lands. Simone de Beauvoir once wrote, "It is always difficult to describe a myth. It does not lend itself to being grasped or defined. It haunts consciousness without ever being posited opposite them as a fixed object. Even in the fantasy, she is captive. Each of the liberatory superpowers offered will tether her to a limited imagination. The power of invisibility allows the feminists in search of missing nonviolent voices to disappear her. Superhuman strength will offer her the physical abilities of masculinity that leave her unsuitable for marriage. Invulnerability will place her outside the safety net of donors, charities, and empowerment advocates alike. She is neither the good victim to be saved, nor the peaceful political agent to be supported. When I meet Akil again a few years later, I mention that people think female fighters have been brainwashed. She smiles slowly. I wonder if perhaps something's gotten lost in translation. I ask again, and she replies, "Yes, I understood. I was not brainwashed. I was motivated to fight." I'll stop there.
Thank you. You picked some powerful bits that even I was going to quote. Thank you, Nimi. Dipali, do you want to start us?
Sure. What a wonderful reading that was, Nimi. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. And thank you, Lila, for hosting us, and to City College of New York. I want to make a few remarks about, how my own intellectual position before I met Nimi and how her work has changed me, and then pose a couple of questions to kind of kick off the conversation. The German sociologist Max Weber described the cornerstone of statehood as the monopoly over the legitimate use of force. States get to decide, in other words, who wields a gun and on what terms. In modern international relations, of course, all states are not created equal. Some, namely Western governments, recognize their right, even their responsibility, to deploy violence in the service of their interests. Sometimes they frame these interests with such confidence so as to be universal and therefore inscrutably good for all involved. They are defined so capaciously as to allow for the use of force, not just in the service of punishing those who threaten, but also on behalf of those, as Laila Abu-Lughod has so powerfully written, who may need saving. The Western state's use of force at home and abroad is consistently afforded the benefit of doubt. Its legitimacy is presumed. If one observes the world from this vantage point, what could be more alarming than a Black or brown woman who picks up a gun? Women have always been the victims of conflict, and sometimes with the right combination of wisdom and courage, they have been granted the role of peacemaker. But the female fighter throws the world off its axis and disturbs the right order of things. Perhaps that is why, from the time I began to study war, I was never interested in women. As a student of international relations, I understood that an interest in women meant an interest in peace building, humanitarian aid, social economic development, and public health. And while all of that seemed unimpeachable enough, it didn't interest me. I started my undergraduate education reading Human Rights Watch reports about the Indian Army's abuses in Kashmir. I pored over UN reports on armed groups and forcible displacement in the Balkans and the Great Lakes. And by the summer of 2001, began 2 decades of an ongoing focus on Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, I concerned myself with the relationship between violence and governance, a relationship I went on to probe in the context of the Syrian revolution. I was endlessly curious about those who sought power, who advanced forms of politics that had the capacity to upend the status quo. And never, and I mean never, in my work did women feature. I accepted fairly quickly that most of my teachers, my supervisors, my colleagues, my research subjects would be men, who, like me, were determined to unravel the puzzles of politics and power that have long inspired and animated war. I was glad to be included and forged my path as a scholar and a policy advisor and an author on terms that were, in my mind, largely, if not entirely, divorced from my gender and my race and the gender and race of those around me. Then I met Nimi. Nimi threw my world off its axis. Here was a scholar who also found puzzles of politics and power to be of utmost concern and interest. But in her mindscape, women populated every nook and cranny of those puzzles. They were victims, they were perpetrators, they were peacemakers, they were war fighters, they were pious, they were treacherous, they were political beings who sought power just like men. And they were living with and through the burdens of the patriarchy, a fact that shaped their struggles, but too often obscured our recognition of their full complexity as social beings. Female fighters, as Gaurinathan explains in her remarkable new book, survive rape while pursuing Marxist politics. They bristle at misogyny within their own ranks, even as they share their male comrades' passionate commitment to the struggle for a recognized homeland. They are Islamists, they are Democrats, they are ethno-nationalists, semi-authoritarian, and everything in between. And quite often, it is in the act of rebellion and the work of insurgent governance that follows, where they are able, finally, to exercise precisely the forms of representation, inclusion, and participation that have so often been beyond their reach in state-based politics. Gaurinathan's intellectual and political commitment to the female fighter offers a kind of creative license to the rest of us, an invitation to rethink many of the binaries that have long shaped our thinking about war, peace, foreign aid, and intervention. When women exercise political power through insurgency, they force us to ask a number of questions we don't usually consider. Are Western states that deploy force in carceral terms at home and counter-extremist terms abroad actually exercising violence in legitimate terms? Is there anything more brutal or barbaric about the use of force by a rebel than an unmanned aerial drone? When women are presumed to be peace-loving and homemaking, do the interventions that follow improve their surrounding political economies in any meaningful way? After reading this book, these questions are going to unsettle and disturb you. They will rattle around in your head, reminding you of their presence every time you try to settle back into thinking about things the way you did before. These questions will provoke more questions, none of which will have easy answers. In my case, the questioning and the discomfort provoked have proved both persistent and useful. I like to think of myself now as someone radical adjacent, a nervous convert, testing out my new revelations as I teach more and more work by female scholars, scholars of color, scholars from the global South, as I force my own theoretical inquiry into unexplored places, situating contemporary conflict and intervention in larger imperial legacies, forcing Western male thinkers and their frameworks into conversation with those from other corners of the globe, often older, sometimes wiser, still rarely read. And finally, I take up my place in spaces like this one, where scholarship is celebrated as its own form of resistance. For Garinathan and Abu Lughod before her, epistemology is inextricably linked to politics, which means that it is the female fighter, activist, strategist whose words are centered. These women are not objects of study for Garinathan. They are her collaborators, her co-conspirators in the production of new knowledge about political violence. Take them seriously, she demands. They have been her greatest teachers, and now they must be ours. And if we are lucky, we will absorb their insights as lessons about the forms of resistance to which we too have access if we dare to act. In closing today, I would like to pose two questions to our remarkable author. First, Nimi, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how the patriarchy features in your argument. I found myself struck by a paradox in your analysis that I've alluded to in my comments, which is the timeless oppression of the patriarchy is part of what makes it easy to see women as victims at war and as victims in many other contexts. Your analysis is surfacing this notion that women must be seen as agents of political change, struggling on behalf of a whole range of ideas and ambitions that should not be overlooked. So I'm wondering, if we take that notion seriously, should we engage with the female fighter, politician, leader as we would her male counterparts? How do we balance her wish to be recognized on her terms with the reality that her gender means that others will continue to define, violate, and oppress her just the same? So that's my first question. And the second question is that you and I have talked often about how one of our key pedagogical philosophies is that discomfort, shame, even helplessness are entirely appropriate emotions in the classroom when you're studying war. And that the temptation, particularly among Western feminists, Western practitioners, policymakers, is always to believe that surely something can be done to right all the wrongs in faraway places. And one thing I love about this book is that it does not offer a single clear recommendation to its readers. They have to just sit for a while in the awkward silence of their work, their choices, their failings. But I wonder if you could offer up a question or two that they might ask of themselves so as to use that quiet time wisely. For you, what do you think a reflective meditation on the part of an enthusiastic do-gooder? What would a reflective meditation look like for her? So I will pause it there and pass it back to you, Nimi, and then I think we'll come back to Lila.
That's such a beautiful and generous reading of this work. Thank you, Dipali. I'll start with the question on patriarchy. I would never, just to be clear, I've never argued that the female fighter exercises complete agency. I have in my earlier academic work, a very clear concept of restricted agency, and other scholars have noted this as a kind of ambiguousness tied to agency. The question is sort of, there's two questions there. The first is how our overemphasis on patriarchy when examining the role of women in liberation struggles obstructs our view of her politics, right? And so first, dismantling that as the lens through which we view this woman, I don't think in order to do that, one has to deny the existence of patriarchy, right? I think that the two can coexist. But the complex way in which patriarchy sort of manifests itself in these spaces is something that is reckoned with by the women in this movement, right? They're not borrowing from Western feminism here. One of the things in recent years that I've been very pleased to see is the writing of female fighters entering into the public discourse themselves. You know, the translations. There's a new book that's just come out of one of the leaders, women leaders of the Tigers, Thamalini, that's cited in the book, that was translated by a good friend of mine, Nedra Rodriguez. And here you see in the words of the fighters themselves, the very complex gender terrain that they were navigating, right? But what you also see is a deep consciousness of the role of patriarchy. It's not something that they ignore, that they dismiss, that they deny, right? It's simply been positioned in a particular place for a particular moment in order to achieve the goals of a particular national liberation struggle, a Marxist liberation struggle, right? And you know, one of the examples that's not in the book is more in my academic work is the idea in particular of the role of patriarchy and nationalism, right? In order to create a national identity, one has to define what it is to be that nationality, right? What does it mean to be a Tamil? If one's fighting for a separate state, who belongs inside, who belongs outside, right? So if the movement is representing a nationalist politics, much of how we think about the nation is anchored in the position of women, right? It's anchored in gendered roles. And for a movement to be seen as upending that, right? The Tigers were very successful at removing things like dowry, right? But had they come across and said, we're going to completely shift this core value of Tamilness, the position of women in society, they would have lost popular support, right? Which affects them across the board from military strategy to the success of the movement itself and recruitment, right? Which is why you ended up having a number of women that I would meet in fatigues that were going around putting up signs of what women should do. This is how you should wear your hair. This is how you should sit on a bicycle. And despite the obvious contradiction to a Western mind, if you challenge them on it, they would say, well, this is what we're fighting for. What else are we fighting for if not to protect what it means to be Tamil? Right. So it's a very complicated question. I think that one that we have to recognize was being had inside movements. Sandra and the FARC understood, of course, that there was patriarchy there. She saw it as her task to dismantle that, but that was secondary to defeating the movement. In terms of recommendations, no, it's always sort of a warning going into my classes. I'm not going to offer you any solutions anyway out. But this work, I think, of dismantling structures for students in particular, I think the advice is always to understand the conditions of your mind's captivity, right? The ways in which we've been socialized. And that includes myself and others, right, through the academy, through now for them, I think politicized lives online, of course, have affected how they're socialized, right? The number of, and so to keep sort of bringing down blinders one after the other and to sit with what you see in that process, there's often, I was an aid worker, of course, I worked for a lot of these organizations that I critique, but there's this idea that you have to be, in order to make a critique, one has to be completely disconnected from complicity, which will never happen. No, we're all complicit in some structure of this. But there is, to me, correlation between consciousness and complicity, right? The greater your consciousness becomes, the more that you sort of inform that consciousness, the more distance you get from complicity. And that's the goal, right? Is to move away from complicity as your consciousness expands, right? And that can be difficult for people who want a quick solution.
Thank you. And we need those answers, right? Of the unanswerable. Did you want to say any more, or could I jump in and add a few?
Please, please do.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Those were like core questions, and it was great to hear you, Dipali, on your shift in the way you were transformed, in fact, by Nimi, which I think a lot of us are. So I had sort of three kinds of questions that came up. I'll see how much time there is. How are we doing? I think we're okay. Um, the first one shifts it back to the book itself, because it's quite an amazing book to read. And you gave some glimpses in your reading, but not really the full flavor. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the form of writing you chose for this book. And I don't even know how to describe the genre. There are fragments, there are dizzying moves between peoples and struggles. It's a book like I've never read, really, especially since so much of on this topic of, politics and radicalization tends to be this kind of deadly formulaic genre of the report or the policy paper. And you describe the book as an escape from academic prose into narrative nonfiction, but I don't think this even begins to capture the way that you blend interviews, deeply personal reflections, those kinds of contradictions you just talked about that Dipali brought up about patriarchy within the movement. How do we wrestle with these things? It's full of poetry and unforgettable vignettes. And in your acknowledgments, I notice you very modestly dedicate the book to your subjects, as you did when you opened today. Um, and you address them this way. You said, "To the female fighters in Ilam and everywhere, you offered me intimate stories of pain, pride, and power, and I feel I had very little to give in return. This book was stalled for many years by my own scrutiny, an obsession to recreate an authentic representation of your courage, passion, complexity, and wisdom. It cannot be perfect, but I send this out into the world in hopes that the reader might feel the weight of your impact on the struggle, that your strength might change them forever, as it has me." Um, Beautiful. And we all think about what the impact of our work is and why we're doing it and who we're giving it to. So as somebody who also thinks a lot about writing, I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about what stalled you in the writing and how you managed to get beyond it or around it or to move forward to actually finish a book that's this amazing. Um, do you want to answer that first, and then I'll see if there's
Yeah,
time for other things? Yeah, because I want to shift to
it's
another
something I've
more analytical thing.
one of the things that's come up most often in my teaching, both at Columbia, well, more at Columbia, I think, than at City College and elsewhere, is the struggle that students have when you offer them the space to write non-academically. It becomes sort of overwhelming, like how would I write in a non-academic way? What could I possibly say? And I think that the aspect of the quote that you pointed to that's most relevant here is the weight, the heaviness of these stories. That pressed sort of deeper inside me, possibly because of my own identity and my connection to these women. But for me, in those years, working with these women, living with these women, and the stories that build up, that pile up on top of you and around you, and behind you, and the documents and the archives, and the weight of that. When I finished the dissertation, when I finished the PhD, hadn't lifted, because I knew that first it had been stripped of any sort of emotional richness to meet the demands of a political science degree at UCLA. Like it had really left these women's emotional and the emotionally driven analysis on the cutting room floor. It was empty, and it was going to be read by 6 people who knew everything about this subject already. And so I think that weight, like pressing down on you constantly, one feels the pressure to disseminate this, right? And to keep disseminating this in different ways. That did sometimes take the form of an op-ed or a policy briefing or whatever. But I think when you get to the project of a book, right? Like what is the political project behind it? It is to excavate things that are deeply entrenched in people's minds, right? And with the female fighter, like I spoke about, you're talking about all these things that are deeply entrenched, right? The xenophobia, the views on nonviolence, the views of gender, right? That goes so deep that one can't really address them head on, right? You have to find ways to get into people's brain to unearth some of these things, right? To leave these questions. And I think the style of writing came from that. How can I do this without saying, you're wrong, this is not how you should look at it, right? How can I get into your brain without you noticing and pull something out, right? So sometimes the form, of course, the book takes many different forms, but sometimes the form was, there's a section in there called The Trouble with Trauma, was more poetic because to me, trauma became personified in our contemporary discourse. There was this thing, this person, this trauma, that was out there and that was actually causing damage. And so the only way that I could deal with it was a poetic sort of creation of a character of trauma. There's the absurdity of it all, right? How do we represent absurdity in writing? Sometimes it's simply in writing the space between reality and how she's perceived, right? One of the pieces in the Female Fighter series of Guernica is based on The Bride of Frankenstein, which I tried to write as a serious critique of countering violent extremism and what happened at that meeting in Italy. And I couldn't write it like that because it was too absurd, right? And so the only way that I could reveal the absurdity was by framing it in The Bride of Frankenstein, of this monster you constructed and then you deconstructed. No, and I think, others have pointed out that the writing is fragmented. I think war is fragmented, lives are fragmented. There is no continuity, there is no. So one has to, again, when you look for this absolute truth in the search for trauma or for genocide or reconciliation, there is no absolute truth. No, there's fragments of memory, of moments. But what's left is the political identities of these women. No, what these moments, what these fragments have shaped. That's what I hope holds the book together, is that core of the shape of political identity that forms inside of them. And of course, there's a visual element, right? There's an aspect of the book that's about the stage, about the performance of rape, right? There's some things that for me in my head, I can see them playing out, right? When I'm talking to a rape survivor about to go to a tribunal in Tunis, it feels to me that she's on stage, that she's performing, right? So how do I get that feeling across is to create a stage in the writing.
Yeah, no, you did it. And it would take me, I need to hold the book in my hand to actually be able to see the structure better, because we were reading the galleys online, which we were so lucky to have. But, to think about how you had set it up and how the fragments related to each other and how we moved from poetry to, terrible stories to analytic work. It was really quite, as I said, not like a book, any other book I know. And I think what you're dealing with is so difficult that you can't just tell it. But I was going to say you could go to anthropology instead of political science and you'd have a little more leeway, but you still couldn't do what you did. So thanks. So to move to another thing that's really at the core of what you're doing, as you said, you're trying to get at these entrenched notions and ideas, and how do you dislodge them? And so there's a quote where you say that radicalizing her is rooted in the perspective of female fighters who demand to be seen as political actors. It posits that the erasure of the female fighter from narratives on gender and power is not only dangerous, but also anti-feminist, unquote. So, of course, this raises for me, and I'm sure many others, one of the thorniest questions in our field generally, and one that I and my colleagues have had to grapple with as we put together this project on the geopolitics of gender violence and what the book that we've now finally finished, we hope, that we're calling The Cunning of Gender Violence, Feminism and Geopolitics. And that is, what is it to be feminist? Um, and because of, as you know, my own foray into the world of counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism, I've been puzzling over the depiction of the women who went off to join ISIS and now the kind of cottage industry around de-radicalization. And like you, I'm amazed at how these women are dismissed, and some of what you read before, brainwashed, lured by social media or romance, instead of being taken seriously as having political analyses. And Akila, who you've mentioned a couple of times already, that section where you talk about the conversation where you say that many people think female fighters have been brainwashed, and she smiles slowly, and you think she hasn't understood what you're saying. And she said, yes, I understood. I was not brainwashed. I was motivated to fight. Um, and so what are the feminists to do with something like this? And for me, the most depressingly familiar section of the book, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think you'll see, this kind of, what is a feminist? What does it mean to be feminist? What kinds of feminists are there? The most depressingly familiar section of the book is when you analyze how the feminists involved in UN Women and NGOs, Women, Peace and Security agenda, how they see things. And you share these very damning quotes from panels you've been on or forums and fundraising events where the victims are trotted out to tell their stories of suffering over and over, tailoring them to the donors. And you quote one speaker. I mean, there's not that much to laugh at in the book, but there are these moments where you just think this is an unreal world we live in. You quote one speaker on a panel who's so out of touch with the conflicts and struggles and the pain that you're describing, the struggles against state violence or occupation that she opines. We've found that most women leave militant movements because they miss their creature comforts, like having a glass of wine with your favorite sitcom. And I'm going, oh my God. And one of your interviewees from Syria, who features a lot, and I wonder if she actually was at that panel we were at, I wondered, she says they don't offer things we need, like legal support, only beauty supplies. And at one meeting, there was a short-term project for ex-fighters from an international group called Brooms and Mops for Reintegration. And you think, like, this must be some kind of joke. But you quote email after email asking you to tone things down. This is a kind of political censorship that my Palestinian colleagues who do projects for Human Rights Watch or UN Women tell me about too. And as you say, for the particular case that you were working on with the Tamil, is a specific identity that's targeted by state violence, and it isn't just women, and it is particular identities that make them targets, including women, will be disappeared inside what you call anodyne categories for minority populations. So you say, dear Nimi, please remove any reference to the term identity in your report, political voice and barriers to participation in Asia. Asia, please replace with marker. So you can't say identity. And recently you've been writing about white feminism. And on page 85, you write, to reveal the racial underpinnings of a feminism that misunderstands the lives of the marginalized will be met with, at worst, public denial, and at best, unsolicited advice in private on how best to stay inside the lines, unquote. And so there's Dear Nimi. Development agencies and white women might take exception with being dispensed with that quickly, and you might lose them for further action. Dear Nimi, in your critique of whiteness, do be careful not to fall into the reverse trap whereby actions of people are first and foremost defined by their race or position. Now, I agree totally that structural inequalities have to be front and center of our analyses. But what we've been doing, and I really struggle with this, I tend to look at the structural positions of the feminists in NGOs, in UN Women, and in the myriad organizations where feminists have made inroads as well. And I would love to hear what you think, but I found Janet Halley's term governance feminism to be really helpful here, especially because so many, at least in my work on the secure feminists and the countering violent extremism groups and their rehabilitation, so many of those who produce the anodyne reports and policy papers that I was reading in that world are themselves women with origins or connections to the global South. So they're not white, technically. So I would like to hear they're just in certain kinds of positions in a political structure. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what the term white feminism does for you. Sort of what does it add? What is it, you know, why is it powerful for you and helpful?
Um, yeah, I think the governance feminism is, of course, very useful. I think it comes back to language. All of it sort of comes back to the limitations of language and also the expansive cover of language, right? So if you use this language of a feminist, um, the limitations of that and, are that generally you're talking about women's rights, right? Sort of that's the focus of the feminists. And even as that becomes more expansive, you can also use this same, it sort of cuts both ways. You can use it the other way, that it becomes this cover, right, for a sort of flimsy political project, right? You have no real authentic politics, but everybody can show up in the street wearing a particular anatomically incorrect hat, and then you have this sort of label, right, that defines you politically, and in both senses, the limits of the word feminist and the cover it provides, it feels politically restrictive to me. It feels uncomfortable to wear, but I'm also not terribly concerned with it, because I think that there's a lot of things that we simply don't have the language for. There's a lot of new spaces, new thinking that to we don't have the language for yet, but the ways of thinking, the ways of deconstructing are there, right? But we fall back on this old language to try and like fit all of our ideas into a particular old language. But the language will evolve. It takes time for that to happen. Um, and I think it comes back to sometimes when I talk about captivity, one thinks automatically, of course, of the women that I've known who have been detained, who have been in cells, who have been abusive marriages or trafficked or something like that, right? But the captivity is something that extends from an incarceral cell to the spaces we occupy in the academy, in the policy world, in all of these various spaces and peace talks. And because again, going back to the idea of consciousness, every woman I've met feels restrained, feels captive, to what she's able to say, to what she's able to articulate, to what ideas she's able, what politics she's able to have publicly and privately. It wasn't my intent. I have never been one who sort of targets other scholars, white scholars or otherwise, for sport. And it wasn't my intent to devote much of this book to the outside reading of my work, and particularly that of white feminists. But it did feel important to me to draw out again the massive space between where these women exist and where the policy world sees them, right? Even if it was just a few short lines and included here and there, and also because I've taught enough sort of policy classes where particularly the women of color look at me with this sort of, no, she couldn't have said that. That can't be real. That's not what happened. But it is real. This is how that world operates. And Marcel, yes, for Marcel, is actually at Columbia, is an incredible. Uh, she's one of those sort of organic political beings who went into these spaces seeing the captivity immediately and challenging it, right? But not everybody can do that. Not if you're working at the United Nations, not if you're looking for tenure, not if you're, your job depends on it. You can't keep unveiling these various forms of restriction. On the question of whiteness, I think I would cite our friend Dr. Kanisha Bond in an interview we recently did for Uddy, where she very clearly says whiteness is an orienting worldview. It's an approach, right? Of course, there's plenty of Black and brown women who hold up the status quo in State Department elsewhere that I've met, but it's a worldview. It's not about whiteness. And there's certainly plenty of white women who have been collaborators, who have been close friends, who share the political project that I do, right? So I don't see this in any sense as a binary. Um, but I do think it's an important moment that we all start deconstructing some of these things that are holding us captive from articulating. The number of women who have said to me, like, I felt like I couldn't say anything in these spaces, right? And for real reasons. People don't get tenure, they get fired. There's stories of women who were sent to conflict zones to do really damaging research, but they had to because their advisor said they should, or um, so again, I think it's to go back to the notion of understanding all of these circles of captivity and breaking through them. I think once one starts to break through them, then the new language emerges.
Thanks. I'm not sure you're quite answered. I mean, now I see feminism should go, and whiteness is a worldview, but it's the worldview that should go. So how do we name these things? How do we get at them? And I think people are trying, and certainly in our project, we're trying with the whole
Yeah.
apparatus of gender-based violence and all the good, well-intentioned work, but within structures that make it impossible for it actually to be radically changed and understood, and the real enemies to be called out. But we're struggling with it too, and I think that's where we are today. And you've brought out so much. That's great. So I had more, but I think maybe we would rather move to some
I'll just say
questions, unless
sort
you
of
want.
quickly that I just fear that not being able to describe something becomes paralyzing.
Mhm.
And so with this book in particular, when you asked about the forum, when you asked about my agent, editors, publishers, they didn't understand it. There was no description, right? There was no, how would you describe this book, right? So without the language to describe it, it could have prevented this book from being written, from being sold. But it's, again, to me, something that operates as a way of silencing then, right? So is just to write it as it was meant to be, as it came out as a political project, and not worrying too much. And it was the describing in itself that probably held it up for like a year and a half, not being able to describe it in a proposal. And then eventually writing it and going back to the editors, and they were like, oh yeah, it all works.
Mm,
But it's just to sort of push that there's a lot of things that can't be described. But the work shouldn't stop,
Mm.
in waiting for that.
I think that's very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we take questions from other
Yeah,
folks?
we have a number of great questions coming up, and some of them have gotten boosts from other participants. So maybe we can start with Sarah Carswell's question. How do theories of violence like Fanon's Wretched of the Earth help us understand or not gendered experiences and intersectional liberation? Do you want to take one at a time, Nimi? What's the best for you?
Um, yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, great.
I'm just going to read it properly. Like Fanon's Wretched of the Earth help us understand or not generation. Of course, these are all sort of instrumental in understanding, the foundations of oppression, right? Which these men themselves didn't always apply to gender, but that we are able to pull from. No, in that sense, one of the things, we're developing an archive now of uh, of violence across South Asia, but from a civilian perspective. And so, behind me, there's all these boxes of art from female fighters, of pamphlets that were circulating, of letters to dignitaries, holding on to the memories of resistance, right, which disappear very quickly under regimes. Um, and what you realize going through is that we've learned our history from men. The struggle has been framed by men. Um, that even for me, there's the history was handed to me by the uncles in my life, by the men in my life, in the US before I went back to Sri Lanka. So the theories of violence, some powerful thinkers. There's a man named Taraki Sivaram in Sri Lanka. There's A. Sivanandan in London. thinkers about racial justice, thinkers about, guerrilla strategy. And I think that it's okay to recognize that this shapes how we think about oppression. It shaped my own, foundationally shaped my own consciousness, while also being conscious that we are learning from men only. That is how history has been handed down to us, and what might be missing there, and what the sort of gaps are there, right? I mean, so I have these like texts by men alongside this magazine produced by female fighters, right? And how do we incorporate both into understanding? For me, the history becomes very important in figuring out your own role in the struggle, which is maybe one of the hardest things to do, is not to try and occupy every role. Maybe you're not the rah-rah revolutionary who takes signs out to the streets. Maybe you have a different role in the struggle, but sitting in these materials and sitting in these conflicting materials, right, from men, from women, gives you an ability to position yourself inside of a struggle that existed long before you, um, and will continue long after you. On the last trip to Sri Lanka, I remember rereading on the train James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son, and you're kind of absorbing all this military around you and the occupation and everything going on. And it's so immediately relevant, the way he's written in a way it's describing your people, it's describing your oppression. And you can't take the power away from that. You can recognize how much that's contributed to our own canon of resistance.
Let me come next then to a question which I think you address so beautifully in the book in so many ways, by Sindhuja Raja, who asks, how do female fighters locate their identity as fighters within identities seen as tied to patriarchal gender roles, as mothers or daughters or wives? Where do these different roles begin and end in political projects like Elam? And where can we locate feminism in these entanglements?
Um, Thank you for that. It's, of course, an important question in the Tamil context in particular. I would say first, would be to disconnect some of these from patriarchy. No, I mean, I think I hope in the book it talks about, in my own experiences, to be a mother, to be a daughter, to be a wife need not be defined by the spaces of patriarchy. It certainly, you know, is very difficult to do, I will say. But, you know, motherhood is one of the things that in the movement itself became quite powerful for me, how the concept of children and raising children was a collective project. It was something in the FARC, when I mentioned I had left my son and that's why I wasn't going to stay much longer. And Sandra said, well, you just leave him with us. You leave him with the FARC and you do your work. The Tigers would say the same thing. Um, so I think that these aspects, again, if I'm speaking from the perspective of the female fighter, to be a daughter, to be a wife, to be a mother in the moment of struggle, we're not defined by culture, by society. There's a really beautiful video that I had access to that's written about in the book of a tiger wedding that happened in the field between two surgeons, a man and a woman. And being able to contrast that with a traditional Tamil wedding, the way that the tigers did this wedding, what was said, how it was simply a commitment to each other and to the struggle without all of the sort of Hinduized Brahmanic, wife is subservient to the husband and all of that, right? So it's, I think for these women, it's about positioning these roles in relationship to their own politics, right? And patriarchy need not be the defining factor there. Now, I will say when the movement was over, those came back with the vengeance. I think that's true in Eritrea, that's true And really every struggle that we've seen, that when that moment, that emergency moment of the movement is gone, you sort of, it's like one of those flowers, no, that opens up a snapdragon and comes right back. It's they're sort of immediately held again to, well, this is what you're supposed to be, because in that moment it was okay because you were fighting for the struggle and you were a martyr and you were, but now you have to be a wife. And now, you know, and this is the struggle of many female fighters that I've spoken to since. um, you know, that you always, people will say in Eritrea, Sri Lanka, you know, she was a fighter because she always has her hair done or her nails done, or she's wearing high heels because she's trying to reclaim a kind of femininity that will allow her to play those roles in a very traditional sense. No, and that, you know, has been very, very difficult for the fighters, and particularly in places like Sri Lanka where the movement was defeated, right? At first they were heroes, and now it's sort of changed or transitioned into, well, you see what happens when women engage in politics. You should be just a wife and a mother. So it's a complicated, ongoing struggle. I think that right now is very pronounced for women in Northeast Sri Lanka.
Next, we have a couple of related questions from Paige Fortna, who asks, can I ask you to talk about how you define or think of the term radical? Does the use of violence by women, especially women of color, equal radical, or does it have to do instead or in addition with a political ideological stance, for example, in opposition to a political status quo? Can one be nonviolent and radical or violent and non-radical? How do you see methods of resistance and goals of resistance in this concept?
Give me just 1 second. Nonviolent and radical. Well, I think there's, I don't remember exactly, there's a line in the book that essentially says, you know, radical is the word for the resistance, the roots of resistance that was taken away um, from the people and was reassigned a meaning by the policy world, you know, of a threat. And, you know, again, in order for the book to enter into a particular discourse and an important discourse, radical was used speaking to that audience who had reclaimed it in a security threat way, but also hoping to draw it back to the idea of the roots of resistance, right? Radical for me, you know, is this, if you think about the concentric circles of captivity, right, that I use to understand some of these women, that they're sort of surrounded by first their family, then by culture, then by community, then by the state, right? These concentric circles. Um, for me, it's that inside all of these layers of captivity, the female fighter made what would be called a radical choice to break through all of those, right? And it's radical in relation to those layers of captivity, right? Because each of those poses its own sort of challenges, its own restrictions, right? Of course, you know, when you go back to the empowerment programming, um, there, the idea is that, well, we're going to liberate these women by offering them, you know, chickens and cows and sewing machines, as if that might be able to help them break through these multiple layers, you know, of captivity. So the choice to take up arms, to immediately sort of at once break through marriage, culture, community, everything that she's been held inside by, is a radical choice, right? I don't know that that's necessarily tied to violence. I don't think that you can say that that choice can only represent itself, can only be seen through violence, right? Violence is certainly an extreme and a last resort for many of them. Even if it was sort of normalized at that time, you know, one of the things that's always interested me, and you know, comes up a little bit in the book, but I would like to write more about, is the women who were supporters of the movement who chose not to take up arms. a huge number of women who were sort of just below, joining for lots of reasons, personal reasons and other reasons. And a lot of those you see now in the mothers of the disappeared who are fighting for their loved ones back. I think these are radical women. Their politics are so evolved and so thoughtful, and they manipulate. They not only break through some of the circles, they manipulate the circles to serve their interests. Right? They use. There's a piece that I have in Eddie called "A Separate State: Motherhood and Political Crisis," which looks at the ways in which women are very conscious that motherhood elicits a particular reaction, a particular kind of empathy, and they use that to achieve political goals. And a lot of them are nationalist women. Their political goal is to have a separate state. They didn't fight. But to them, they're now manipulating motherhood in a way to achieve what they wanted or to move closer to that. No? So I don't think, no, there's a necessary correlation between radical political action and violence.
Can I jump in on this? Because it relates to one of the other things that I was thinking about in your book, and sort of the connection between the politics and the violence. And it's not in the mother direction, but a different direction, which was, you care deeply about Sri Lanka and the Tamil struggle, and that's what you know so intimately, in your most disturbing interviews and details come from there. But you move back and forth in an amazing way, I think, to other places and other struggles, each of which is different, and there may be commonalities. But I sort of understood when I was reading that women who've been part of political struggles and had carried weapons had a lot in common, including often sexual violence at the hands of militaries. And I was especially interested in the just things they mentioned too about the interviews revealed that many of these women met each other in, from different struggles in London and other places. So Sudanese, Eritreans, Tamils, Palestinians, there were these networks. But then I was really, didn't quite know how to think about this, which was how you thought about the relationship between these militant women. So we're still on the violence side, but it has to do with what's does it mean to be radical and what does it mean to be violent. That these militant women who'd participated in political struggles with what you call imagined political futures, right? I mean, they're nationalist struggles, they're separatist struggles, they're against a certain kind of regime. And what's the relationship? How do you think about the relationship between them and the sort of individual women or groups of women that you describe who are determined? And it's really a rising movement, I think, in Latin America, who are determined to fight the epidemic of what they call femicide, say in Mexico, especially at the border. And they accuse the state of doing nothing about the murders of young women, but it's not exactly the state that's doing it. So who's the adversary here? What's the actual political struggle that they're part of? And the examples you give are of Diana the Hunter, who shoots this bus driver for not protecting women, or gangs who patrol public spaces to protect the young women from being murdered. But this is a response to kind of patriarchal violence that's connected to various things, but it doesn't connect to organized, militarized political movements against state violence, as in the case of the Tamil Tigers or FARC that you talk about for Colombia. So, those state violences are for sure themselves gendered, and you show how patriarchy brilliantly, I think, encircles these political women in all sorts of ways that are not the targets of, marriage, motherhood, rape, cultural norms, all of that. You've talked about that. But there you're talking about violent women as acting inside of a process of self-determination. But in a way, it's a group self-determination rather than their own. And so and it's a collective struggle. And so I was trying to think how you relate that to the Mexican femicide case. They are radical and feminist against femicide, but there's
Mm.
no male compatriots in their struggle. And what's the liberation going to be? So it's this sort of violence, radicalism, and collective political ideologies, which I think Paige Fortuna's question related to. The other ones we recognize, the Marxism, we recognize the ideology that motivates the women and the men. But in this case, I'm not sure what it is. And so I just, I
Yeah,
was
I
very
have,
interested in that part and how you thought about putting them in the same
yeah.
book.
I
And
mean,
maybe before
yeah,
you
go ahead.
uncomplicate that question even a little further and ask, what about women who are the first to join state-based armed forces in terms that are highly disruptive? What about white nationalist women who take up arms, or the women who participated in the riot on the Capitol building? I wondered, maybe a slightly different twist on Lila's question, which is what kind of radical compatriotism might there be between women of very different ideologies, but who too are moving into spaces where we don't usually associate women with the fight?
Yeah, I think I'll start with Lila's question because it's one that has been very difficult for me. I think as with all of my work, and I think with your work too, we have a community of women, of activists, of the ones that sustain us, the ones that know. And so the work on femicide came largely through my very good friend and sort of comrade Valeria Luiselli, and her connections and her you know uh, family, and I actually worked with her niece was my student, and we went down there together. Femicide was a very difficult thing for me to grapple with because I couldn't get to any sort of real causal driver, right? I couldn't get to one. There was these, like, again, dismembered fragments. It was the narcos and the Catholic Church, and machista attitude, and the state, and drugs, and all of which, as a compilation of factors, exist in other countries, right? And femicide is this particular thing that is not just in Latin America, just in Mexico, but is very, very dominant there. And it's saying something different to us, right? Rather than saying, that where you want this, patriarchy is like the domination over women, femicide is a society without women. No, like it's entire neighborhoods without women, right? That have been killed in the process of the femicide. I did actually, for me, my assumption, and I think that one of the things learning research sort of properly as an academic, and if you do it properly, you should always have your assumptions proven wrong. And, Mexico proved a lot of them wrong. And doing the work on femicide there, because I went in expecting to find militant resistance, to find, and there were a few, sort of gangs of women who were militarized, but there was not a large militarized resistance to femicide. Um, there was an organized resistance. There is an organized resistance, and I think a really, really powerful, really politicized one. It doesn't show up in the ways, which is where I sort of come back to what the barriers are, because when you identify the barriers, there's so many things that we're missing when we have these barriers up, right, to how we see women's political identities. If you're just going to look for the woman who is marching in the street, then you may not see the protest of women. You may not see the resistance, right? But if you see the woman who's been raped by a soldier in a village in Sri Lanka who doesn't report that she was raped because the village is getting more water that year and the whole village is doing well, as a form of political action, right? One that we wouldn't recognize immediately as political action, right? But the forms that are coming out of Mexico, no, there's There's traditional folk songs that are coming out, a new album. I don't have the name right now, but that were shared with me with the testimonies of women who killed their abusers. And each track is the testimony in court of a woman who killed her abuser, right? And so it's not sort of directly taking the framing of a female fighter and reapplying it, but it's taking some of the lessons, some of the notions there, right? The link between self-determination and choice, whether it's individual or collective, right? Feminists in the US like to talk about choice and freedom and all that, right? But the complexities of choice, when you apply it in a context like Mexico, right? Killing an abuser then becomes a form of self-determination. You know? And it is individual, but it is also a pattern, right? That's happening across there. So I think, there's of course, there's plenty of scholars and thinkers. And one of the reasons I cite Dolores Durantes in the book so much is because I think she took something that was so huge, this femicide question, and she put it in this sort of beautifully poetic book style and somehow managed to grapple with all of it, with the anger, with the indignity, in this poetic verse. No? And so I think that the forms of expression that are coming out of the resistance to femicide, we should be watching, we should be looking at, to see the same signs of self-determination, of that desire to have control over one's own life, the right to exist. It just manifests itself differently. No? And I think, Dipali, for your question with the white supremacists, that in the essay in the Los Angeles Review of Books, that is primarily the difference for me. Like when I quoted Kimberly Crenshaw in her interview to me, who said, you have to be clear that the politics of a white woman buying a gun and a black woman buying a gun are completely different. That distance from a visceral threat to your life, in shaping your connection to an ideology, that has to be parsed, right? Which group is actually under threat? And I do just quickly think a lot about women in armed movements. There was a AFRICOM meeting in Ethiopia that I attended once, and of course, because it was about women and peace or something, the Nigerian military sent all of their women cutters instead of the ones who were engaged in sexual violence and all of that. But in those conversations, you find very, very often that there's a stronger link between gender in a militarized context and the experience of women in these spaces than there is to the enemy lines, right? When they would ask me about women who joined the rebel movements or Boko Haram or others, they would see similarities in the experiences they had inside military cultures. So there is a line there, I think, that we'll keep seeing start to grow as you have women joining militant movements and women joining state armies.
Well, I'm looking at the clock and saying there's so much more to say, but I think we have to wrap it up. And I wanted to thank you, Nimi, so much for this very generous, thought-provoking answers, and Polly for tough questions, and the audience who we didn't get to answer as many of their questions as we wanted, but to thank you all for being here today, and to thank CCNY's Colin Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership for hosting us so that we could actually learn about and celebrate this new book, Radicalizing Her, which a book to buy, definitely, a book to read, definitely, and out next week, April 13th from Beacon Press. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lila and Dipali, so much for this.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I wish we were in person.
I know, me too.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.